My contact information's here. If you guys have any questions, you can sort of take a screenshot right now and get back to me, and I'm happy to answer them. But let's talk about Nelson Hackett. In the 1840s, Nelson Hackett was probably the Arkansan who was best known worldwide. His name was brought up to Queen Victoria and Prince Albert. His fate was debated in Parliament. His actions caught the attention of abolitionists throughout the entire Atlantic world. And so one of the things that we're trying to figure out is how did an enslaved man from Fayetteville, Arkansas, capture the attention of the diplomatic corps of the Atlantic world? Queens, princes, presidents all debated his fate. And so I want to start off by talking to you about Nelson Hackett and his escape from slavery in Fayetteville. And Nelson Hackett was an enslaved man. And he does not appear in the historical record really until after he flees Fayetteville. And there's two versions of Nelson Hackett's escape. One is the Alfred Wallace version, and Alfred Wallace was the man who held legal title to Nelson Hackett. And what Alfred Wallace said is this: he said that Alfred Wallace said, "I was away, and I came back, and Nelson Hackett had fled, and he had ransacked my house, taken a horse, a saddle, a coat, a hat. He went to my neighbors and stole a gold watch, and he fled." The other version comes from abolitionists, especially an abolitionist who talked with Nelson Hackett in Michigan. And this version is that Nelson Hackett and Alfred Wallace were at a horse race, some distance from Fayetteville. And Alfred Wallace wasn't returning home, but told Nelson Hackett to go back to Fayetteville. And Nelson Hackett, with the horse and the saddle and the coat and the hat and the watch, simply left Arkansas and left slavery. And Alfred Wallace sends a guy named George Grigg to track down Hackett. And it's only after Hackett flees that he enters the historical record. And Alfred Wallace, after Nelson Hackett escapes, files bills of sale at the Washington County Courthouse to establish Wallace's ownership. And the thing on the right, I know it's hard for you to see, it's probably covered up. It's about the sale of a certain Negro boy named Nelson, about 24 years old. And he was sold to by a guy named Jacob Cartwright to Willis Wallace, Alfred's brother, and for a younger enslaved boy named Moses and a gray mule. So this is what we know about Nelson Hackett. Jacob Cartwright sold Nelson Hackett to Willis Wallace, and then Willis Wallace sold Nelson Hackett to his brother, Alfred. Many of you might know Alfred Wallace. He was involved in the Arkansas State Bank in Fayetteville and received lots of criticism for that. But Hackett then moves from Arkansas across the state of Missouri. The one account we have of his flight comes from the Peoria Register. It's reprinted in the summer issue of the Arkansas Historical Quarterly if you want to take a look at it. But it seems that Nelson fled north from through about Springfield area, north to the Missouri River, and then he headed further north to a place called Marion City, Missouri. And Marion City was an abolitionist hub. It was the city itself was founded by a white abolitionist by the name of David Nelson. Nelson was later run out of Missouri for his abolitionist ideas and set up shop in Quincy, Illinois, right across the river. And Nelson and David Nelson and his associates ran an operation in Marion City, ferrying fugitives across the Mississippi River and connecting them to the Underground Railroad. And it's very telling that Nelson Hackett from Fayetteville knew where to go on the Mississippi River to find allies to help him cross. There were networks, communication networks among enslaved people that helped Nelson Hackett escape. The same Nelson Hackett was escaping, and he went to Marion City, and so did Alfred Wallace and the people trying to find him, the slave catchers. And they pick up his trail in Quincy, Marion City, and they notify Alfred Wallace. And what Wallace does is he says, I'm going to just go to Canada right now. And Alfred Wallace sets off to Canada. And Nelson Hackett connects up with the Underground Railroad in Quincy, Illinois, right here, and makes his way to Chatham in Canada West, what is now Ontario. And Chatham is right here. This is some 600 miles, and we don't really have good accounts of this trip and this journey. And he arrives in Chatham, and we don't know if Chatham was a destination that he chose for a particular reason, whether he knew people who were there, or whether just by its reputation. But Chatham was considered Canada's Black Mecca. It had a vibrant population of fugitives who had escaped slavery in Kentucky. But in Chatham, there was a lot of white animosity. White people in Chatham didn't like being Canada's Black Mecca. And so there was a lot of racial tension in Chatham. And Hackett arrives there in early September of 1841. A few days later, Alfred Wallace arrives. And on September 7th, 1841, Wallace finds Hackett and has him arrested on charges of theft. During the arrest, Wallace and Canadian deputy sheriffs beat Hackett over the head with a whip and a stick, and they can extract a confession that Hackett says, yes, I stole all of those things. With this, Hackett is moved from Chatham, which is right up here in this map. I don't know if you can see my pointer, to the Sandwich Jail. And the Sandwich Jail is on the Detroit River, just across from Detroit. And once Hackett is moved to the Sandwich Jail, Canadian officials have to debate what to do with him. And as most of you know, in the early 1830s, the British Empire abolished slavery. In fact, Canada West started the gradual emancipation of enslaved people in 1793. And so Canada had a reputation of providing refuge for enslaved people who escaped the United States. And its policy was not to extradite enslaved people for the simple fact of running away. But Alfred Wallace said, we are extraditing Nelson Hackett because he's a thief. And this set off, the Canadians had to figure out what to do. The British Empire had to figure out what to do. And in February of 1842, the governor of Canada, a guy named Charles Bagot, decided that Hackett needed to be returned to Arkansas to face charges. And what Bagot said is this: one, it's obvious that Hackett is guilty, and two, Canada doesn't want thieves putting down roots in their community. And so in 1842, Hackett becomes the first fugitive from American slavery that Canada extradites back to the United States and back to bondage. By the way, I don't think I'm giving you guys telling the end of the story. Hackett's also the last fugitive that Canada returns to the United States. He's the only one. And Canada, and in the middle of the night on February 8th, 1842, Hackett is bound, tied up, blindfolded, bag over his head, and put on a boat across the Detroit River. I can't imagine anything worse than being bound and being blindfolded and put in a boat on choppy, cold water in the middle of February. And he was put in the Detroit jail. And when he was put in the Detroit jail, that city's Black community organized to try to prevent Hackett's return to the state of Arkansas. They formed, or actually reformed, something known as the Colored Vigilant Committee. And members of this committee wrote resolutions. They contacted allies in the abolitionist movement in Boston and Liverpool and London and Manchester and Boston and New York. And the African Americans, the free Blacks of Detroit, did is they publicized Hackett's return. And they activated and mobilized a transnational abolitionist community to help free Nelson Hackett. The short of it is it did not work. In April, people arrived from Fayetteville to transport Hackett back to Fayetteville. And they fixed him up with a hobble. And a hobble is a 3-foot wide steel iron contraption that function like chains to constrain movement. And Hackett and the two people taking him back to Fayetteville got on a Great Lakes steamer in Detroit, up Lake Huron, down Lake Michigan to Chicago, staged from Chicago to Peoria. By the way, in the town of Princeton, Illinois, Hackett briefly escapes. He's gone for 2 days before he's recaptured. He's taken to Peoria and put on a steamboat to St. Louis. And from St. Louis, Hackett is returned to Fayetteville. We don't really know the route he took. Steamboat to Napoleon, Arkansas, the mouth of the Arkansas River, and then up to Van Buren is probably the most likely way. And in the summer of 1842, in June, Nelson Hackett is returned to Fayetteville. There are two accounts of what happens to him in Fayetteville. One is in a letter that the abolitionist Lewis Tappan writes to Arkansas's Congressman Cross in 1842. And the other is an account that appears in the Liberator. And the Liberator is William Lloyd Garrison's abolitionist newspaper. And this account in the Liberator comes from about a decade later, when another enslaved person from Fayetteville, a guy named William Murdoch, recounts to abolitionists what happened to Hackett. And that is what you can see over here on the right. William Murdoch. William informs me that Hackett was brought back by Wallace, who had 450 slaves. Wallace did not have 450 slaves. There were only 450 people in Fayetteville at the time. That Hackett was kept in handcuffs, closely watched, flogged with great severity 5 or 6 times, and then sold off to the interior of Texas. The whippings consisted of 150 lashings the first time, and then other amounts at the subsequent whippings. We've since learned that Hackett was actually put on trial. There's records in the Washington County Courthouse of his trial. There's lots of questions about the accuracy of these records, and it's an avenue of further research. By the way, he was sold to Texas. When a slave with scars of so many whippings is sold to Texas, and it was the Republic of Texas at this time, it was before the annexation, they're sold so that they can be worked to death. Being sold off to Texas was a death sentence, meaning that Nelson Hackett would meet his demise by being worked to death. What we do know is that after he returned to Fayetteville, Nelson Hackett escaped a third time. The last words in the written records about Nelson Hackett is that on his way to Texas, he escaped. And Congressman Cross writes an abolitionist and says, look, we don't know where he is. He could be dead. He could be recaptured. He could be free. We just don't know. And so Hackett's fate is unknown. We don't really know what happened to him. But, and this we do know, that the abolitionist community, both black and white, in the United States and in the British Empire, would not allow Hackett's extradition back to Arkansas, would not allow it to set a precedent. And at the same time, all of this was going on. Secretary of State Daniel Webster, and this is his picture over here, and a British diplomat by the name of Lord Ashburton were negotiating a treaty between the United States and the British Empire to resolve disputes between the United States and British North America. And this is a larger treaty. It involved boundaries, trade on the Great Lakes, the policing of the international slave trade, but also extradition, because bands of outlaws and bandits were going across the border in places that are now Maine to escape punishment. And Webster and Ashburton are negotiating this treaty at the same time that abolitionists begin to pressure the British government to make sure that no more enslaved people are extradited back to slavery in the United States. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty, especially Article 10, what it does, Article 10 is the extradition procedures. And what the Webster-Ashburton Act does is it codifies the process that was used for Hackett's extradition. And once the tentative treaty is published, abolitionists, white and black, British, Canadian, American, they become extremely angry. And they mobilize to prevent Article 10 and the extradition procedures that were used to justify Hackett's return to Arkansas. They mount a campaign against Article 10. And this begins. The Webster-Ashburton Treaty was negotiated in Washington, D.C. Before Lord Ashburton leaves Washington, D.C., Lewis Tappan and Gerrit Smith, two of the most prominent U.S. abolitionists, they visit Ashburton and they say, look, you know about Nelson Hackett. You know about Nelson Hackett. We cannot allow this to come. And Lord Ashburton assures Tappan and Smith. He says, look, the British Empire is committed to the abolition of slavery and fighting and helping remove slavery from across the globe. Ashburton says, we need the extradition procedures, but the British government will make sure that this is not abused by slaveholders. Lord Ashburton's assurances do a little bit to placate Tappan and Smith, but they also realize that being American citizens, they're not the best people to lobby the British government. And the real campaign, the real abolitionist campaign against Article 10 of the Webster-Ashburton Treaty comes when Parliament has to approve the Webster-Ashburton Treaty. And abolitionists within the British Empire mobilize to prevent Article 10, to prevent the extradition of future fugitives. That's hard to say. And in these arguments, Nelson Hackett is at the center. And the abolitionists say, look, if the Hackett precedent is allowed to stand, slaveholders will use theft as a pretext for claiming fugitives across the board. The 12,000 former slaves living in Canada will no longer be free. They also say slaves are legally chattel in the United States. They're property. That Nelson Hackett was traded for a mule. And that chattel, because they are property, cannot be tried in courts. As John Quincy Adams said during the Amistad case, you cannot try a cow. And slaves in the American legal system have the same legal standing as a cow. And what the abolitionists are saying is, if you're going to treat human beings as property, you have to be consistent. And lastly, the abolitionists said that that enslaved people cannot receive fair trials in the United States, and you cannot have an extradition process without the assurances of fair trials. In fact, one abolitionist said during these debates, said, look at Nelson Hackett. He has been returned to Arkansas, and he is, quote, in the fangs of tyrants. And these abolitionists, and they were led by this guy on the right. His name is Thomas Clarkson, and Thomas Clarkson is probably right up there with William Wilberforce as the most prominent abolitionist in the British Empire. And when Article 10 goes before the House of Lords, the Tory government says, look, if we change Article 10, the US Senate will reject the entire Webster-Ashburton Treaty, and we cannot have that. And instead, what the Tory government does is it provides assurances to members of the House of Lords. We will make sure that this system is not abused. When it moves to the House of Commons, more assurances were issued to placate the abolitionists. The demands for extradition can only come from the federal government. Guilt has to be assured. everything. And what comes from this process, these parliamentary debates in England, is when the Webster-Ashburton Treaty is finally ratified, Britain's colonial office sends instructions to Canada and to other British possessions to discuss extradition procedures. And these instructions make extradition all but impossible. And in 1843, implementing Article 10, the first case came up, and it dealt not with Canada, it dealt with the Bahamas, another British colony. What happens is a fugitive enslaved man kills his owner during an escape attempt, gets on a boat, makes his way to the Bahamas, and the state of Florida comes over with an extradition request, a warrant for the enslaved man's arrest, and says, look, under Article 10, you have to give us back this man so he can face charges of murder. And the colonial officials in the Bahamas reject the request. They say, look, you have to provide us evidence that he's guilty. And the request has to come from the federal government. Moreover, what the colonial officials in the Bahamas say is this: the British Empire does not consider it a crime to kill your owner during an escape. That's only natural. That slavery is a violation of human rights, and enslaved people have the right to escape. And if incidental to that escape someone's murdered, it doesn't matter. With the Bahamian rejection of this extradition request, the abolitionists declare that Article 10 is dead. And the abolitionists, both in the United States and the British Empire, say the debates over Nelson Hackett changed the whole tenor of extradition. And after Nelson Hackett, Canada and the Bahamas will be refuges for American enslaved people who want freedom. And so Nelson Hackett puts into motion the events that make sure that Canada remains a haven for fugitives. And so I want to conclude this story about Nelson Hackett, but by explaining why this story is important. And I want to start right here in Northwest Arkansas, in Fayetteville, where I live. There's a general belief that slavery in the upcountry South, in places like Fayetteville, was much more benign than the plantation slavery practiced in the Arkansas River Valley, the Red River Valley, or the Arkansas Delta. But if we look at Hackett's treatment, if we look at the deeds of sale, it's quite clear that Hackett was seen as property, as chattel. He was sold for a gray mule and a small boy. And this tells us several things, but we can also look at his treatment. The fact that he was whipped over 100, he was whipped on 6 occasions, and one of the lashes was over 100. This is cruel. But the further we looked into slavery in Fayetteville in 1840, using the census records, 28% of the population of Fayetteville in 1840 was enslaved. This is a higher percentage than the state as a whole. But the closer we look at this census data, strange things appear. One, Nelson Hackett was the only adult male. Most of the other adults, and there were very few adults, were women of childbearing age. Additionally, most of the enslaved people were children. And it becomes quite evident that the white people of Fayetteville, or at least the white slaver class, were breeding slaves for profit. They were buying and selling children for their own economic advancement. And so the early leaders of Fayetteville were engaged in a type of economic activity, an economic activity that helped lay the foundations for the town, that was based upon the breeding of human beings. And understanding stories like Nelson Hackett and looking deeply into individual slaves reveals patterns. But also, looking at Nelson Hackett's story is essential for understanding human agency. If we think, if I asked you at the beginning of the session, you know, what's the most impotent person that you can imagine in 1840s America? You would say an enslaved person in a frontier outpost like Fayetteville. Well, what Nelson Hackett does through his own volition, his own agency, is putting into motion the events that ensured that Canada remained a refuge for those fleeing bondage. Hackett activates a network of abolitionists who used his flight to lobby on behalf of future fugitives. And these efforts paid off. And Canada becomes the destination of choice of those fleeing slavery in the United States. By the way, there's also a Supreme Court decision that makes it more difficult in 1842 for enslaved people to live in places like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts and New Hampshire. And so it's happening at the same time. But also, it's important to remember that fugitives were one of the two big drivers of the sectional crisis that led to civil war. The two big drivers of the sectional crisis, one people are familiar with, slavery in the West. And you learned in school the Missouri Compromise, the Wilmot Proviso, the Compromise of 1850, popular sovereignty, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, Dred Scott decision. All of those have to do with issues of slavery in the West. But what Nelson Hackett reminds us is of the importance of fugitivity to the sectional crisis. That it is arguments and debates over fugitive slaves in places like Wisconsin and Ohio that were just as important to the sectional conflict as issues of the West. And understanding fugitives' place makes enslaved people like Nelson Hackett not peripheral players in the sectional crisis, but at the heart of it. And it puts enslaved people and their agency at the heart of the process that led to civil war and emancipation. And one last thing, the website. We have a website, and it is designed for high schoolers. I had it beta tested on my son when he was a senior at Fayetteville High School, and you can see the URL for it. You can also just simply Google Nelson Hackett Project, and it will come up. And the website was the academic content was provided by me and other scholars at the University of Arkansas. But Red Rooster Design down on School Road in Fayetteville, they did they made it look pretty. And so they get a lot of credit. So with that, thank you. Thank everyone.